Su-taxwiye, we're going to get started now with our next presenter. Our next presenter, who really needs no introduction, as many of you are here because of her kind and generous invitation to be here. But it's my pleasure to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Heidi Kiiwetinepinesiik. Dr. Stark is a thought leader in the field of Indigenous governance, whose scholarship has profoundly shaped how we understand the revitalization of Indigenous political and legal traditions. She is the author of numerous publications that continue to guide dialogue and conversations in multiple fields, and currently serves as a co-editor of the Native American Indigenous Studies Journal. Equally inspiring is her commitment to guiding and mentoring graduate students, where she offers guidance and care to the next generation of scholars that really ripples out into the world in such a good way. In addition to all her amazing professional contributions, she is a mother to two amazing tiny humans, a role that all of us have seen how it has further grounded her work in the values of relationality, responsibility, and care. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stark.
Sarah said, I'm going to call you a thought leader. I was like, okay. So, of course, that's what led to much of the laughter. I'd like to begin with a little creative fiction. No. Well, Buju and Dinaway Maganadug, Buju Nijiwag, Kiiwetinepinesiik Indigo, Buju and Dodem, Mikanakwa Juing Nindunjaba. So, hello, my relatives, my friends. My name is Kiiwetinepinesiik, or Kiiwetin, or North Thunderbird Woman, or Heidi. I'm from Turtle Mountain, and I'm from the Lynx clan. And I just want to first raise my hands and express my gratitude to Dr. Butch Dick for welcoming us to this beautiful territory and for opening this symposium in such a good way. I also want to acknowledge Stamakleton Ian Sam for all his tireless work and for speaking for our family in this way. And Brianna Bear, and again, Dr. Butch Dick, for grounding our morning in the teachings of Lekwungen governance and care. And of course, I also must acknowledge these four Kwewag, these four women who've taken up the task of witnessing the work we are aiming to do here across these 2 days together. And to all of you in joining us in this endeavor to consider what it means to restore Indigenous jurisdiction through an ethic of care. We were astonished, and you can see that, I think, by the agenda, to find that every person we invited, except one who was already had a pre-existing commitment, enthusiastically accepted the invitation. And while some were not able to join us in the end due to unforeseen conflicts that arose, we recognize the significant commitment you've all made to be here, either as speakers or the many participants who we know will shape the dialogue that will unfold. I initially conceived of this event as an opportunity to bring together a number of community leaders, scholars, and practitioners committed to taking up both the questions and work of restoring and enacting Indigenous law and governance through an ethic of care in the everyday and across the various scales that we govern. So wanting to move beyond a mere scholarly analysis of an ethic of care within Indigenous law and governance, I hoped to mobilize a practice of care in organizing the gathering from the ground up. Thus, knowing my own shortcomings, I immediately recognized the need for this to be the collective work and reached out to Sarah Hunt and Sarah Morales, two people whom have both shown me a great deal of generosity and love and taught me so much about what it means to live in an ethic of care for others. And indeed, they have not disappointed. They both continually teach me what it means to show up for one another in the everyday. And they don't just show up, they do the work. And more than that, whether it's been in organizing this gathering or in our work with one another or in our friendships, I always know it's okay to show up as my ever imperfect self, and that my shortcomings and failures will be held with care, that I can be vulnerable, and that I can ask for things I need, and that will be met with grace. They make me a better version of myself. They make me want to be kinder, to be more gentle, more loving, and more compassionate in how I meet others. So in many ways, their everyday actions, they answer the question that I seek to ask today, which is, how do we cultivate an ethic of care? And so here, just to provide a little bit of background for some of the thoughts and reflections I want to share. A lot of my own work has been trying to take up the question of how do we address harm and conflict as it arises in our communities, looking at questions of how we attend to those who have experienced sexual assault, intimate partner violence, those who have been caught up in the child welfare system, and those who are struggling with housing precarity and addictions. And so often, I found myself wondering, why is it that we're so willing at times to wrap some people and some forms of harm in care, but aren't willing to do so in others? And so in many ways, some of my reflections today are shaped by some of those moves in which we've responded to those who have harmed by turning them away from our communities. Concerned about what it will mean for us if we continue to lose our own, I'm interested in thinking about how we can cultivate infrastructures of care that can bring our relatives into modes of engagement with one another that are healthy, generative, and loving. I'm just gonna keep drinking a ton of coffee. It's like, I said to them, I think I'm dehydrated, I'll get coffee. And Morales was like, I don't think you're supposed to drink coffee if you're dehydrated. See the care? I love it. So what if we thought of law as generative instead of punitive? What would our worlds look like if the aim was to cultivate something instead of correct it? So to cultivate infrastructures of care and relational accountability, how would we do this? And this is not to say that we won't need frameworks for correcting behaviors, but what if we started with cultivation instead of correction? What if we thought of our legal traditions and governance as a means to build the worlds we want to live in, as mechanisms to discover and hone our individual gifts while contributing to our nation's collective well-being? So in reflecting on these questions, I'm reminded of the time I spent with John Barrows, another person who taught me to be nicer than I naturally am. I was like, oh man. We would teach these law camps and people would be like, you guys are so different. And I was like, mm-hmm. I was like, what gave it away, the tattoos, the smoking, or the swearing? John is terrible that way, No. So in his community in Cape Croker, the elders there continually reminded us that Indigenous law lives within us. His mother, Anishinaabe elder Jean Barrows, spoke of the power of our legal traditions, saying, if you teach them the principles, they will govern themselves. So this vision of Anishinaabe self-governance, I think, reflects a legal order grounded not in coercion, but in relational understandings and modes of engagement. And they were speaking, Lindsay, his daughter Lindsay Barrows, and Hannah Askew were speaking with a number of the elders because they had just passed this written code to protect the water. And so this one elder was actually a bit saddened to hear that. And they were surprised, like, we know you love the water. Why are you sad to know we passed this law? And so these are just some of the words she shared. So Nipitan, I was like, it's written a little different than I'm used to. Heidi of Chippewas of Nayosh First Nation said, the kinds of laws that have to be written down and enforced using coercion against people are, in a sense, laws for the lawless. meaning that these kinds of on-the-books laws are alienated from the legal traditions and values, so that the laws have to be imposed externally upon people, rather than the laws being part of a person's identity and way of life, as they may become when people are educated in the laws through our stories and other means from a young age. So for this elder, like many Anishinaabe knowledge holders, externally imposed coercive legal systems are a deviation from Indigenous governance, where our law is supposed to be, at least, an embodiment of relationality, personal accountability, and an ethic of care. But how do we make law part of people's everyday, part of their embodied practices? How do Indigenous nations, in their efforts to revitalize our laws and the governing institutions that house these laws, contend with the impacts of colonization on our communities, institutions, legal orders, and relational practices? Can we imagine a future in which law functions in its generative capacity instead of its prohibitive character? What if we were committed to restoring Indigenous law and authority then not as a punitive tool that mirrors the state, but as a generative framework for how we can mobilize relational accountability and care, to produce a form of relational accountability that brings our relatives back into these relational modes of being? So while Indigenous scholars have been able to make clear argumentation for the existence of our legal orders and have worked to extrapolate legal principles out of our philosophies, stories, and practices, our law is ineffective if we cannot find ways to embody it in our everyday, in how we relate to one another, in how we care for one another, and how we come to make decisions about how we address harm and conflict as it arises in our communities. As our nations work toward the restoration of our political authority and legal orders in the face of state drives to contain, control, and regulate our daily lives, we must strive to do so in ways that don't replicate the very systems we continuously critique. Instead, we must reorientate our views of law. I guess I'm going to say it not as a punitive tool like 17 times, sorry. I wrote this at 3 a.m. So not as a punitive tool of the state, but instead a generative mode of radical relationality. It must move away from notions of individualism that separate out community accountability to both those that have been harmed and those that have harmed. Indeed, if we live in a web of kin obligations, as our teachings tell us, then we must turn our minds to building up the infrastructures of care that can give meaning to these laws and produce accountability that exceeds the binaries of victim and offender, of right and wrong, and criminality and legality. We must work to restore legal responses to harm that focus not exclusively on punishment, but instead work towards repair, restoring our people to their whole selves. As Anishinaabe scholar Quill Christie Peters asserts, she has a forthcoming book, check it out, comes out in October, I think. She asserts that on wholeness requires us to experience presence within our bodies, but the ability to exist in a truly embodied state as an Indigenous person feels nearly impossible in a settler colonial world intent on the destruction of Indigenous life. Many of us do not live in a constant state of wholeness, she says, like our ancestors did, but rather within various degrees or varying degrees of disembodiment. She reminds us that our entanglements with settler colonialism have resulted in many of us not being able to remain in our wholeness and instead seeking the protections that disembodiment provides. Indeed, in thinking about how law and governance can cultivate care, we must also attend to the harms that our communities have experienced. As Anishinaabe scholar Eva Jewell, who you'll hear from during our time together, reminds us, reproducing Indigenous worlds through care is a necessary act for Indigenous futures, land back, language reclamation, and decolonization. Yet Indigenous peoples, she says, have been systematically prohibited from socially and culturally reproducing our norms, behaviors, and embodiments. Jewel reminds us that while we are still here culturally reproducing our worlds as Indigenous people, a culture that is both informed by respective Indigenous worldviews and felt experiences of surviving the various conditions of violence under settler colonialism, the mainstream social world that so many of us live and interact within is still a settler colonial world that does not reflect our values and ways of life. And here I'm reminded of this story among the Anishinaabe of a woman who becomes a bear. And in this story, it begins with her husband discussing how much he hates her and decides to leave her to return to his family. Enraged by this, the woman transforms into a bear and goes in search of her husband. She finds his village, first killing his father, the chief, and then wreaking violence on the community, killing nearly everyone. She then finds her husband, who tries many times to kill her, even setting her on fire. Yet she cannot be killed. She escapes and finds his little sister, whom she enslaves and tortures. The young girl then plays on the woman's vulnerabilities, telling her how amazing she is and how in awe she is in others' inabilities to kill this bear woman. Flattered, the woman reveals that she cannot be killed because she hid her heart, telling the little sister that she placed it in her toe. The story concludes with the young girl telling her brother of the wife's vulnerability so that he's able to successfully kill her, which he does. And while I recognize the intense harm the woman was causing, indeed taking many people's lives, I also can't help but feel a bit sad when I think about that story. I wonder how often, because of our own experiences with harm, with hurt, with trauma, do we also look for ways to protect ourselves, to become disembodied? How often do we hide our hearts? Much like this bear woman, and as we see with her, what kinds of harms do we end up enacting on others because our hearts are no longer where they should be? When we are busy hiding our hearts to limit our own vulnerabilities and pain, we too can easily reproduce the very harms we seek to shelter ourselves from. So how do we bring our hearts back into the center of our law and governance? Indigenous scholar Christine Finley argues that inasmuch as colonization consists of damaging ruptures, decolonization relies on the attempts of the broken to love, care, tend, and heal relationships with our ancestors, land bases, and other people. Looking to the 2013 film Rhymes for Young Ghouls as a radical vision of decolonial love, Finley reminds us that a source of love, of care, can come from our ancestors, what she calls ghostly care. She reminds us that our ancestors are with us and can provide sources of care and protection when we are enveloped in families and communities that are struggling with the capacity to provide the care we need. She asserts that, quote, one element of decolonial love and its formation of care, sociality, and relationality is that it extends beyond temporal and terrestrial realms, calling instead for restorative and wildly reparative otherwise visions and relations from and among ancestors, ghosts, and those who live in the ghastly thresholds of social life, the criminalized, the marginalized, and the disappeared. In analyzing the film, Finley understands both the young brother that has passed away in a tragic accident at the opening of the film, and the father who's wrongly incarcerated as a means to protect his wife, serve as ghosts, as providing care for the central character even in their absence. But what might it mean to turn to our ancestors as sources of care? Indeed, Indigenous governance is deeply relational and evidenced across many nations with reference to this importance of 7 generations. And while some translate this to mean that we must govern with an eye to the future by 7 generations forward, others have also referred to this teaching as one that operates across, or perhaps more accurately, outside the scales of linear time. For those of us living today as sitting in that fourth generation, looking back 3 generations and looking forward 3 generations. Indeed, within Anishinaabe-Moin, the word for great-grandparent and great-grandchild is the same, in Dunakabijagun, meaning I am interconnected with or tethered to, reminding us that Indigenous governance systems are rooted in our relationality, reciprocity, and accountability. These systems animate an ethic of care for the land, for our kin, and for the future generations. And in doing so, they draw on our ancestors as sources of care and love to propel us forward. Quill Christie Peters also recognizes our ancestors as important sources of love and care, noting, importantly, to be whole is not some idealistic state of being that is free of pain and suffering. To be whole is simply to have access to all that we are and to be present enough, even if just momentarily, within our own bodies so that we can feel our ancestors, our homelands, and the great beyond pulsing within us. Echoing these sentiments, Finley finds that state approaches of care to be paternalistic and extractive, arguing, our work instead is to take responsibility for each other and recognize that our survival depends on collective wholeness, interdependence, and community caring for each other. And as Michelle Daigle, who you'll hear from right after this, notes, relations of care evoke full and fluid conceptions of Indigenous kinship that exceed colonial territories and identities, such as First Nations reserves, treaty territories, geopolitical borders, and fixed notions of indigeneity and family. As she notes, these relations of care are mobilized and operate beyond territorial containers, enabling relation processes that sustain our communities to flourish. Our legal traditions and governing systems, of course, have been deeply impacted by a history of colonialism. We no doubt have work to do to bring forward our own laws and traditions in meaningful ways that can attend to the various challenges our communities and our people face. But too often, in considering how to restore our law and governance systems that have been impaired by colonization, we don't also consider then the impacts that this colonization has had on our people and abilities to enact ethics of care through those systems. We must consider then, I think, how this work has to be done simultaneously alongside the work of repairing the relations across peoples within our communities. People that have been harmed and caused harm, that have strong forms of relational accountability and broken relationships, that have hidden our hearts and struggle in meeting each other with generosity and care. So how do we cultivate care? How do we draw on our ancestors as sources of care? And how can we turn to our legal and governing systems as a means to cultivate the infrastructures of care we'd like to see operate in the everyday? And I'm going to leave you with those questions. Thank you.